At 29, Steve Callahan shoved his homemade sloop, a 6.5-meter vessel he'd designed and built himself, christened Napoleon Solo, into the Atlantic, thinking the ocean would simplify his life into clean numbers: wind, miles, time. A week after departing El Hierro in the Canary Islands on January 29, 1982, 800 miles from land, something hit in the dark and the boat filled like a sinking room. He crawled into a life raft with almost nothing, watching his only shelter vanish beneath black water. No radio, no beacon, just salt, thirst, and a horizon that never changed. For the next 76 days, survival would come down to one brutal rule: improvise or disappear. When Steve Callahan pushed his sloop off the lee of the Canary Islands and aimed the bow west, he believed he was leaving behind more than a chain of volcanic rock. He believed he was cutting loose from a year that had come apart at the seams. Marriage dissolved, plans revised downward, the dull ache of realizing that adulthood was less a destination than a series of improvised repairs. At 29, he already carried the restlessness of someone older, and the Atlantic offered a clean arithmetic: wind, water, distance, time. Out there, the world simplified into things you could measure. Trim for, endure, Callahan's boat. Napoleon Solo, a 21-foot sloop, small, stubborn. Self-built, wasn't a luxury yacht or a romantic prop. It was the kind of craft assembled by a man who preferred competence to comfort, who trusted what he could tighten with his own hands. He'd already completed a full transatlantic crossing to England before aiming the bow toward the Caribbean, roughly 3,000 miles of open ocean. A month if the weather behaved, less if it felt generous. In the beginning, the sea did feel generous. For days the trade winds were gentle, the sky a clean blue dome, the swells rhythmic enough to lull him into the sense that the ocean was a place you could live in rather than merely survive. He settled into routines that made solitude feel like a chosen discipline instead of a sentence. He exercised. He listened to the radio. He kept the boat moving with the calm attention of someone tending an animal. At times he imagined himself as amphibious, belonging out there more than he belonged anywhere ashore. Sailing invites that kind of delusion. When the horizon is unbroken and the days are made of light and water, it's easy to believe you've stepped outside ordinary consequences. A week out, roughly 800 miles west of the Canaries, the Atlantic reminded him what it was. The wind came up hard, 35 knots and climbing, and the waves began to stand taller, their faces darkening, their crests blowing away in spindrift. Callahan had seen worse weather before. The ocean is full of people who say that just before the ocean educates them. He engaged the autopilot at night and went below, letting the boat shoulder through the swell while he tried to sleep in the cramped berth, his body rocking in a jerky rhythm as the hull slapped and groaned. On the night of February 4th, 1982, there was a sound that didn't belong, an abrupt, concussive bang against the bow, as if the boat had been struck by a train moving underwater. The next sensation was colder and more final. Water surging in, not a leak, but a flood. The cabin filled so fast, it seemed less like sinking than like being swallowed. Within seconds, the water was above his chest, then his neck. In the dim light, he had no clear idea what he'd hit: container debris, a submerged log, a whale. But it didn't matter. The hull had failed. A boat is a theory of safety. When the theory breaks, the ocean takes over. Callahan climbed for the companionway, with the frantic economy of someone who understands that panic wastes oxygen. He surfaced into wind and spray, and in the darkness on deck, he went for the life raft canister. If the raft didn't deploy, he would die. Not poetically, not dramatically, simply and quickly, dragged under with the boat and held down by the indifferent weight of water, he pulled the line. It kept paying out. Nothing happened. Again he yanked more line. Still nothing. For a moment he experienced the particular terror of malfunction, not the chaos of storms, but the betrayal of equipment designed for exactly this moment. Then the canister finally burst open with a dull pop, and the raft began to inflate. He got into it, a 6-man Avon inflatable, barely 6 feet across. Just as the sloop lurched and settled lower, the deck tilting, and then another calculation arrived, colder than the seawater in his clothes. The raft held a few basics: 8 pints of water, a knife, 3 solar stills, flares, but not enough to keep a man alive in the middle of the Atlantic. For very long, everything that mattered, charts, tools, extra water, fishing gear, the emergency ditch kit, was still below, lashed inside a cabin that was now a black tank filling with water. Common sense said to stay in the raft and float away. Biology said the same thing. But survival is rarely a matter of common sense. It's a matter of doing the one thing that might work, even if it feels insane. He dove back into his sinking boat. Inside it was darkness and turbulence. Objects swirling, lines tugging, the pressure of water rising. He felt rather than saw the kit and started cutting it loose, fingers clumsy, mind shouting at him to hurry. He got it free and kicked toward the hatch. At that instant, the hatch slammed shut, either by a wave or the shifting angle of the boat, and the world became pure confinement. Water above, water around, no air. There are moments when the body decides the outcome before the mind can form a thought. His lungs burned. His hands found the hatch, pushed, but the pressure held it closed. He was going down with the boat. Then a wave rolled the hull just enough to trap a pocket of air. Callahan inhaled an animal gulp, humid and foul, and shoved again. The hatch opened, and he shot out into the night like something expelled. He made the raft, coughing and shaking, clutching the kit as if it were a passport. Behind him, his sloop continued to die with a quiet inevitability, slipping lower until it was only a dark shape in the black water. Then nothing at all. In a span of minutes, he had lost the vessel that had carried his ambitions, his escape plan, his proof that he could build something functional from the wreckage of his own life. The Atlantic did not negotiate. It accepted payment. By morning, the storm had eased to something merely unpleasant, and the true scope of his predicament came into focus. The boat was gone. The raft was absurdly small against the ocean's scale, a brightly colored dot on a moving desert. The sky was empty. The horizon was a perfect circle in every direction. There was only water, an element that could kill him in 6 ways, while refusing him the one thing he needed most, a drink. He had no radio, no beacon. EPRBs were not monitored by satellites in 1982, and he was in too empty a part of the ocean to be heard by aircraft. He had told people back home not to worry if he was late. No one would come looking soon. He did the math and felt the bottom drop out. He was drifting westward on the south equatorial current, roughly 1,800 miles from his destination, if the current ran true. His first crisis was water. The kit contained a small cache, 8 pints. Perhaps a week, if rationed mercilessly, along with 3 solar stills. plastic devices invented during wartime to keep downed pilots alive. In theory, you poured seawater into the still. The sun heated it, and condensation collected as fresh water. In theory, Callahan set one up carefully, waited, and got nothing. He tried again. Still nothing. The still sat in the raft like a joke with a straight face. An object designed to save him that refused to function. A storm passed and gave him another possibility. Rainwater. He rigged the raft's canopy to catch, run off and drank what collected, only to discover it tasted like chemical bile. The canopy's dye leached into the water. It wasn't just disgusting, it felt dangerous, as if he were poisoning himself one mouthful at a time. He stopped. He was adrift in the world's largest reservoir, and he couldn't safely swallow any of it. Somewhere in those early days, desperation began to shape his thinking into strange angles. He wrote a message in case it was ever found, his name, his position as best he could estimate. The fact that he was drifting and believed himself doomed. The act wasn't melodramatic. It was bookkeeping. He rationed water to a few sips, barely swallowing, letting it wet his mouth, and hoping his body would accept the illusion. Thirst isn't merely discomfort. It is an invasion. It turns the mind into a narrow hallway leading to a single door. The ocean glittered around him, and his tongue felt like cloth. He returned to the solar stills with the stubbornness of someone trying to crack a code. He took one apart, risking the loss of precious equipment just to understand how it worked. The revelation was infuriatingly simple. The still had to be inflated to a precise tension. Too slack, and it failed. Too tight, and it failed. He adjusted it again, waited, and finally saw a bead of condensation slide down the plastic and collect a spoonful of fresh water. It was not much, but it was proof that the universe hadn't closed every door. The relief he felt was disproportionate, almost intoxicating, because the human mind clings to evidence of possibility the way a drowning man clings to driftwood. After a week, he ran into his next wall: hunger. He had a few emergency rations, but they were meant for days, not weeks. His body began to cannibalize itself. He could feel the hollowness grow behind his ribs. The sea, indifferent again, offered fish, sleek shapes ghosting beneath the raft. He had a spear gun, crude but usable. He leaned over the tubes and tried to strike. He missed again and again. Fishing from an inflatable raft is a gamble. You must lean close enough to reach the fish while avoiding the motion that can flip you into the water, and you must not puncture the raft with your own weapon. When the spear gun's mechanism broke, it felt like the ocean was laughing. The range shrank to inches. He kept trying anyway. Hunger has its own kind of faith. By day 14, he finally managed to spear a fish. Mahi-mahi, the most reliable quarry that gathered beneath his raft. It thrashed silver and wet, and he hauled it into the raft with shaking hands. He ate it raw at first, because cooking was a complication, then learned how to dry strips in the sun and waste nothing. With water trickling from the still and fish in his stomach, he discovered a brutal truth. Survival was possible. Not comfortable, not dignified, but possible. That was when the shark hit. In the night, the raft jolted as something heavy slammed into it from below. Then again, the tubes lifted, the whole world pitching. Callahan struck downward with his spear, heart hammering, convinced that if the raft tore, he would be in the water and the story would end in seconds. The shark, large, insistent, battered the raft like a bully testing a fence. He hit it hard enough to make it back off. It disappeared into darkness, but the encounter left a residue of fear that never fully washed away. In the raft, there was no safe posture. Sleep became a series of shallow collapses. On the 15th day, he saw a ship on the horizon. It was the first human presence he'd seen since the night his boat sank, and it looked enormous, an industrial cathedral moving across the sea. He shouted until his throat burned. He fired flares. The ship seemed to angle toward him. He could smell diesel and believed with a sudden, childish certainty that his ordeal was ending. Then the ship passed by, close enough to throw a wake that rocked the raft, close enough to make rescue feel like something he'd dropped. It never slowed. No one appeared at the rails. It moved on as if he were invisible, which in practical terms he was. He entered the shipping lanes and learned another ugly lesson. Over 76 days, he would sight 9 ships in total, most clustered in the 2 sea lanes he crossed, and not one would stop. He signaled when he could. More ships passed. None stopped. After a month, he understood the scale of his isolation in a new way. It wasn't just that no one had found him. It was that no one was even looking. He had told people not to worry. He was now living inside the consequences of that casual sentence. One day, pulled taut by exhaustion and grief, he cried. Not because tears solved anything, but because the mind sometimes needs a physical release when it runs out of explanations. The raft carried him westward anyway, the currents doing what currents do. The Caribbean became not a destination, but an ultimatum. If he drifted too far north, he could miss the islands entirely and be swept back into open ocean, into an indefinite voyage measured in months and madness. He checked his crude navigation, stared at the sky, tried to make sense of drift and wind with a mind that was slowly being sanded down by hunger. Life in the raft was an assault of small miseries that added up to something monstrous. He couldn't stretch out fully in the 6-foot raft, so he slept curled, waking with cramps. Saltwater sores opened on his skin where the raft rubbed, and the salt worked into them like ground glass. Under the tropical sun, the heat became punishing. The stills produced only so much water, and his body demanded more. Dehydration made everything sharp-edged, every thought, every choice, every drop. Hunger hollowed him further. The body is pragmatic. It dismantles itself to keep the heart and brain running. He was losing muscle from his legs, face tightening, strength leaking out in the steady reduction of capacity, like a battery draining. Before rescue, he would have lost close to 40 pounds, nearly a third of his body weight. Then, in a moment of cruel absurdity, a fish nearly killed him. He speared a large one, and as it thrashed, it drove the broken spear tip into the raft's tube. There was a hiss and a rush of bubbles. The bottom ring of the raft deflated quickly, and the raft's stability changed from precarious to catastrophic. Now he was living in a structure that was actively failing. A deflated raft can't be fished from safely, can't be managed with confidence, doesn't drift properly. It becomes a slow-mo show, sinking. He tried to repair it with whatever he had: patches, cord, relentless improvisation. He pumped it up again and again. It leaked again and again. Eventually, he broke. There's a point in a long ordeal when the mind stops projecting a future and begins to accept only the present, and the present becomes unbearable. He lay down and surrendered to the thought that he would die there, alone, unobserved, another missing person swallowed by water. In that mental collapse, old griefs surfaced, the failures ashore, the relationships he had intended, the ways he had drifted even on land. It wasn't self-pity so much as a bleak inventory, as if his life were being summarized by a clerk. Then fear, raw, immediate, snapped him back. Not fear of suffering, but fear of non-existence. The simple animal insistence that he was not done. He searched for another solution with the frantic clarity of someone moving against a deadline he could feel in his blood. And he found it in something ridiculous, a fork. He used it as a lever, as a brace, as a tool to secure the patch in a way his hands alone couldn't manage. The repair held. It wasn't elegant. It wasn't guaranteed, but it held long enough for the raft to regain shape. Long enough for him to resume the grim maintenance of survival. The victory was quiet, but it was real. And in the arithmetic of the ocean, small real things matter more than big beautiful ideas. By then he was so depleted that even success felt temporary. Days continued to peel away. After 66 days, the solar stills began to rot, the cloth elements failing, the plastic losing integrity. When they stopped working, he understood what it meant. The last reliable factory of fresh water in his world had shut down. He had a few cans of emergency water left, but those were a countdown, not a solution. His mind began to slip at the edges. Salt levels rose in his body. Thoughts wandered into strange territory. He felt the pull of seawater as something almost reasonable. There's water right there, the primitive part of him insisted. Take it, the rational part answered with the only truth that mattered. Seawater kills. He began to worry he'd miscalculated his position, that he was north of the islands and would drift past salvation into the endless Atlantic. The fear wasn't dramatic. It was dull and heavy. The weight of imagining months more of thirst and fish and repair, months more of being unseen. He had never been dead before, he thought, and wondered if this slow fading was what death felt like. Then the ocean changed its language. One day he saw debris, plastic bottles, fragments of crates, the scattered refuse of human life. It was ugly, but to him it was a sign as bright as a lighthouse. It meant currents were near land, that the south equatorial current was carrying him towards something. At sunrise, he saw green on the horizon, an island, unmistakable, rising from the water like an answer. The sight hit him with an emotion that was almost painful. After so long, surrounded by nothing but sea, the solid presence of land felt impossible, like a hallucination made real. He drifted closer and realized the coast was guarded by cliffs and coral, an austere fortress that did not welcome small rafts. After everything, he might still be dashed to pieces on the rocks. He decided the voyage would end that day, one way or another. By then, he was a skeleton of the man who'd left the Canaries. Legs wasted, skin damaged, eyes sharpened by hunger. He had been alone so long that his senses had changed. Colors seemed too vivid. Smells carried emotional weight. The world felt electrified, as if his nervous system had stripped away every filter to keep him alert. On April 21st, 1982, his 76th day adrift, local fishermen near the island of Marigalante, southeast of Guadeloupe, spotted the raft offshore. They had been drawn to it not by his signals, but by birds hovering overhead, attracted by the small ecosystem of fish that had accumulated beneath the hull over nearly 3 months. They came out in a small boat and hauled him aboard, speaking to him like a man who'd wandered into the wrong story. He tried to explain that he wasn't out there for a tan. Humor arrived as reflex, a thin line thrown across the void. They took him to Marigalante, tens of miles from Guadeloupe, and barely removed from his intended destination of Antigua. an irony that would have been funny if it hadn't been so brutal. He weighed around 100 pounds. His muscles had withered. He would spend weeks in a hospital recovering, re-entering a world of walls and beds and voices. Later, people would describe his survival as heroic, and it would be tempting to make it a clean parable about grit. But the truth was messier. Callahan survived because he kept doing the next necessary thing, even when the next thing felt pointless. Fix the still, catch the fish, patch the raft, drink the spoonful, keep watch. He survived because his body clung to life with an ancient stubbornness, and because somewhere beneath the despair and he believed he still had unfinished business on Earth. His memoir, Adrift, 76 Days Lost at Sea, published in 1986, spent more than 36 weeks on the New York Times bestseller list, a testament to how much the world needed a story about refusing to disappear. Out in the Atlantic, the ocean did not reward him. It did not punish him. It simply continued being what it was: vast, neutral, lethal. The survival story belongs to him not because the sea changed, but because again and again he refused to let his own mind become as empty as the horizon dot. Listen,